Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another JVS movie review brought to you by the Middleburg Film Festival. This film here could be considered one of the most highly anticipated films for the comedic element of the year, and this is The French Dispatch by Mr. Wes Anderson. So here's a quick synopsis. We'll get into the cast and then get into the film. A love letter to journalism set in the outpost of an American newspaper in a fictional 20th century French city that brings to life a collection of stories published in the French Dispatch. And this one stars, and this is a huge cast. So I'm really only going to focus on a few that I feel are the most important characters in this film. We have Mr. Bill Murray. We have Mr. Owen Wilson. We have Elizabeth Moss. Tilda Swinton, we have Benicio del Toro, we have Frances McDormand, Timothée Chalamet, we have Mr. Jeffrey Wright, and then Mr. Stephen Park. Now, those are a lot of names here to go through for this movie. And the first impressions of this film is, if you are not a Wes Anderson fan, do not watch this movie. You will not like this movie. It's a chance you will hate this movie or walk out of this movie. You may not feel like going through everything that the film brings you through if you're not a Wes Anderson fan. This is the most Wes Anderson movie ever created. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is really up to you, the audience, to decide if you are into his type of work. So the main focus of The French Dispatch is Arthur, who is played by Bill Murray, passes away. He gives away instructions on what's to happen with his paper, The French Dispatch, once he passes away. So it's a situation where they do obituary and then 3 memorable stories that were published by The French Dispatch. And that's what he wants. And the film is going through the motions of setting all of his plans in focus. So the film really breaks down into what you can consider 4 acts. The story of Arthur, his passing, and what the reporters are piecing together for the final issue of The French Dispatch. Once we get to that part of the story, we get to 3 distinct stories from The French Dispatch. The first one by Tilda Swinton's character, and that is the concrete masterpiece. That is the one that stars Benicio del Toro, as she plays a reporter who is reporting on an inmate who happens to be becoming one of the greatest artists of the 20th century, and the hijinks that go along with everything that he does. The second story is told by Frances McDormand's character, and that's called Revisionist of I want to get this right, make sure. Yeah, a revisionist of a manifesto. Yep, with Timothée Chalamet playing a young man who is leading a student revolt in this fictional French city. And she is there to not only report on the story, but also to help rewrite his manifesto. Very interesting things happen with that, and it also leads to a little bit of compromising positions that it puts Frances McDormand's character in. And the final story is called The Private Dining Room of the Police Commissioner, and this story is told by Jeffrey Wright's character, the reporter, who happens to be a food critic, who also happens to have perfect memory and can, at a drop of a dime, word for word, recite any of his articles. That is the 3 or 4 main parts of this film. Now, here's the issue. Almost all 3 stories are boring. It is what it is. It is... While it is the most Wes Anderson film humanly possible, visually it is amazing. And it's everything. Any flaw that you've ever thought you saw visually in a Wes Anderson film is corrected here. This film looks amazing. It is live action animation, because that is one of the best ways to describe what Wes Anderson does. Is if someone took animation, which this film also has an animated segment in it, that's just part of what we'll get into a little bit. But if someone took animation and decided we're going to do it completely live action, and film it, That's the way Wes Anderson films come across. And it can be maddening for some people, or it could be stunning when done correctly. For The French Dispatch, this movie looks amazing. He does a great job of setting up shots and setting up the actors and putting them in these precarious situations and setups that really work well. The problem is the story doesn't work well. This may be why it's one of the most Wes Anderson films ever made. As the director himself said, like, he wanted to do this film with no restraints, which is kind of odd, because if you've seen anything for Wes Anderson, you're kind of wondering if the prior films were you with restraints. My God, what would happen if you didn't have any? And we get The French Dispatch, which is at times too loose, at times too goofy, and extremely wordy. This is a film that packs so much into every scene. It's so much dialogue in this movie. At times while you're watching it, you just wish it would pull back some and you would let some moments breathe instead of talking me through the moments. Because as you're talking me through the moments, it's taking you out the story. Once it takes you out the story, it is really hard to get back into the story because it's a lot of story. So once I take you out of it because I'm talking you through everything, you get lost. And once you get lost, it gets boring. And once it gets boring, you'll never be able to correct it. Now, the bright spot for me was Jeffrey Wright. Even though his character is very wordy and a mile a minute, humanly possible, like every monologue humanly possible, they decide to give to this character and put in this movie in his segment of this film. But Jeffrey Wright is so charismatic in this role, it works. Unfortunately, his story that the character is in doesn't work, but he works, and he works well in this film. He is a bright spot in this film. I can't say it's necessarily any bad performances, but what I can say is the actors feel misplaced. It's just too much. At no time does it feel like you're giving the actors any moment to breathe, to set up the characters better. It's like when you want the characters to be set up better. It's a very interesting thing that happens with Frances McDormand's character. And her backstory should be extremely interesting, that you bring in a reporter in to help rewrite a manifesto, and she ends up in a compromising position with the person who wrote the manifesto. The whole thing is something that could be interesting if you did not feel the need to fill in every small moment with lots of dialogue. And when you do that, you just take everything out of it. So again, if you are a fan of Wes Anderson, this may be the film for you. If you are not a fan of his brand of humor, at this point, I realize in this movie, I may not be a fan of his brand of humor, and I like a lot of his past work. But if this is him, like, unfiltered, unbothered, then I'm not a fan of Wes Anderson's brand of comedy. It felt too much. It literally felt like you had a director say, I want to do a Wes Anderson film, and him go overboard in the style of a Wes Anderson film. And then as an audience member, you would watch it and be like, well, you wanted to make a Wes Anderson film, but you just went too far. Unfortunately, this is a film by Wes Anderson, and I could say that about it, and that is weird. So, The French Dispatch, again, brought to you by the Middleburg Film Festival. Out of a possible 10, I'm going to give The French Dispatch a 5.5 out of 10. This movie has lots of flaws. It looks amazing. Absolutely amazing. I really like Jeffrey Wright in it. Benicio del Toro in the very limited portions of him being in the film. I really liked it, but it wasn't enough for me to even mention his performance. But Jeffrey Wright is definitely a bright spot here. The cinematography is a bright spot here. Wes Anderson's direction is a bright spot here. This is just the first time I've seen a Wes Anderson film where I thought it was overly too much dialogue and that the story lacked. And while this is a love letter to journalism, maybe next time don't put so many words in that love letter and let the actual art of journalism shine through. Because if that would have happened, I think we would have got a better movie here. But this has been another JVS movie review. Peace, people.